Okay, good morning. This is the Santa Claus edition of the Gardener Community Meeting. Today we have two topics in the agenda from Tim Usner about validating webhooks for the new Shoot API. And Peter will talk about preview of the terminal split panes. Tim, I think you can take over.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, so let me share. All right, so you should see the presentation.
Yes.
Switch to the presentation mode. Okay, does it work for you, or do you see the presenter mode?
No, it's okay.
Okay, great. Yeah, good morning, everyone. So thanks for joining the community meeting. Yeah, so I want to present something we've worked on for the extensibility topic. This is, yeah, you consider it as some of the last miles before we reach the final goal of extensibility. And this one is about validating webhooks for our new Shoot API. So I want to give you a little recap how Gardener looked before extensibility. So we had the Gardener and its components, the API server, controller, manager, and scheduler, everything in the Garden cluster. And of course, since the Gardener API server lives in the Garden cluster, we also had the API itself in the Garden cluster. So everything in tree, but also hard-coded for the providers we supported, like AliCloud, AWS, and so on. So this was the situation basically before. You might know that. So this is the old API. Basically, you also probably know that. So we had, for example, we had AWS hard-coded inside the manifest and all the necessary configuration. And since everything was in tree, from the API perspective, it was quite easy to validate the stuff you or the stakeholder typed in here, the Shoot owner. And it was also pretty easy to default all the provider-specific values. So we have a bunch of different if-else branches in the code, saying, for example, if the if AWS is there, then you have to do this and that in order to validate or to set default values for this AWS provider. All right, so this was the situation before, quite convenient but restrictive. And what we wanted to do with extensibility is, of course, we wanted to move out the specific provider APIs now to the to each and every specific provider. You see on the right side. So in the seed cluster, there are different providers, for example, for AliCloud, Azure, AWS, GCP, and so on. And each and every provider has its own specific API. So the provider which is responsible for the respective infrastructure is also responsible for delivering the concrete API it needs. So this means every provider specifics are exported from the Gardener API server, which makes it quite extensible, of course. That's the reason why we call it extensibility. And but gives also, or comes with this, yeah, it comes with more complexity in the end, because we now have split that up and the logic lives scattered, not in one cluster anymore, but in two, basically. What does it mean? So we can still, I mean, okay, we have backwards compatibility. This one is still the v1 beta 1 old API, but can also also goes for the old for the new API. We now have issues since we don't live in tree, and we cannot validate anymore, and we cannot default anymore. And this is a huge disadvantage on the one hand side for every Gardener operator, because you want to ensure that every Shoot manifest that is applied or any Shoot change that is applied to the Garden cluster complies with different restriction. Of course, you don't have that if you don't have validation, and also it is quite convenient for for every garden user if you have defaulting in place. All right, so what we basically did is we wanted to still get back to the old possibilities in terms of validation and defaulting. And the idea behind it is that we now place, or that you can now as an operator place a new component to the garden cluster. And this is of course a webhook in this case. So for example, for Alley Cloud, you would place a webhook, or you would apply a validating webhook configuration, or for defaulting and mutating webhook configuration to the garden cluster. So in the garden cluster, there would be some kind of small HTTP server and handling all the requests for the shoot object that are applied to the garden cluster. But most importantly, the code base itself lives in the provider extension. So we don't have the specific code knowledge of the infrastructure provider in the Gardener anymore, but we have it on the provider side. And of course, this also goes for every other provider like AWS and so on. So this is the basic idea. So where we are today, so we have this pull request. We started with AWS. It's in the meantime it was already merged, and maybe I can switch quickly to my browser. So you can find it under controllers, and for, as I said, we started with AWS. We have the provider AWS, and yeah, there you now have a second, so to say, binary, which is compiled, and this one is the validator AWS. And so if you as a operator want to go and have this validating webhook in the garden cluster, you can start with the example we just provided for you. So there's a new example. It's a 40 validated webhook configuration. And for example, it's quite convenient for your local development. You just apply the configuration to your local development cluster, and then you can try it out and test it out. And of course, we also provided some Helm charts for you, so that you can conveniently deploy the validating webhook configuration to your garden cluster. All right, so wasn't a big topic from my side, but I think it was quite important to mention what we do, on what direction we move towards validating and defaulting in the future with extensibility. Do you have any questions to this?
Seems there are no questions. Thank you, Tim.
All right.
Then we can switch to Peter.
Okay. So I want to give you a short preview of what we do in regards to the web terminals, how we enhanced it meanwhile. But before I do that, I start with the current implementation. So here on the cluster details page, we had two buttons, one for accessing the control plane of a cluster and one for the cluster itself. When you click on one, you have two tabs here at the top, control plane, cluster, and you can switch between them. But the problem is you cannot have them side by side, and you only have one terminal session here. So now let's switch to the new implementation. So this is, like I said, work in progress, and there are some UI bugs here and there. So yeah, we are still working on it. So now you only have one button to access the terminal, and then you are asked to where you want to have the terminal session, to the control plane or to the cluster. So I selected now the control plane, and I can whatever do stuff here. It's pretty slow. Okay, there. And now I can also create a new pane. So I have a shortcut, and maybe we also add a button, or most likely we also add a button somewhere in the UI where you can bring up this menu. Now I can, for example, have a new pane for the cluster right next to the control plane. Yeah, and I can, for example, create another one. Let's make that bigger. And we also added drag and drop support, so you can drag the toolbar at the top, and like an item, you can then drop it somewhere on the pane. Yeah. And yeah, that's basically it.
Cool.
I wanted to show.
Are there any questions to Peter?
Or maybe someone has some requests, some feature requests.
Maybe you could show the list of terminal sessions in the dialog.
Yeah, I mean, you already see it here.
Yeah.
The pod. So when I create a new terminal, another one will appear here.
Hmm.
There it is. So.
And maybe, so you mentioned the button on the top, but it would also be nice, like if for example, in iTerm or whatever, I have a plus sign for a new tab or a browser. So plus sign, and then maybe the pop-up would be the result or the effect of the plus sign pressed.
Don't know if I got it right. So
yeah, similar like you get a new browser tab.
Yeah. So instead of the shortcut, or in addition.
Yeah, but you can have both.
Yeah.
I mean, not instead, but you said the button, so I was saying so that is the plus sign that I mean.
Yeah.
I have a feature request. Would be cool if you could bring your own -rc file, for instance, if you have a lot of aliases or whatnot.
Yeah. You can configure your own image here.
Ah, okay.
And currently we do not persist it. So if you reload, and then you will have the default again. But if more and more are starting to use it and would change this issue, this image, of course we can make this. Yeah, we can persist it. Yeah.
Apart from that, pretty cool.
Yeah.
Now can debug the clusters from my Chromebook as well.
Is it possible to change the colors?
Currently not, but of course we could.
Maybe add a light theme or something.
Yeah. Makes sense.
You're approaching Christmas.
By the way, are the terminal pods started with some elevated privileges, or are they just plain usual pods without like host PIDs, host network?
So the terminal sessions for the control plane, they're all unprivileged, and for the cluster terminal sessions, you can choose if you want to have a privilege pod.
Ah, nice.
Or we can change it here. Cluster privilege, you can select the node. This one only has one. Change it. And this terminal, yeah, of course, will be scheduled on the cluster itself and not on the infrastructure on the seed.
Cool.
Yeah, really powerful.
Okay.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we have any other topics to discuss? Seems not to be the case. Then have a nice Santa Claus and see you next time.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.